Pennsylvania is one of the oldest states in the country, and it shows. Beneath the rolling hills, inside the mountains, and behind the chain-link fences, there are places that the public has never been allowed to see. Some are off-limits for safety, some for secrecy, some because the government decided you simply don't need to know. Today, we're counting down the 20 most mysterious places in Pennsylvania that you cannot visit. Number 20, Raven Rock Mountain Complex, Adams County. If you've ever driven along Pennsylvania Route 16 near the Maryland border and noticed a sudden wall of razor wire appearing out of nowhere, congratulations, you found it. The Raven Rock Mountain Complex, also called Site R, sits just outside Blue Ridge Summit, and it is essentially a city buried inside a mountain. Construction began in 1951 under President Harry S. Truman, ordered in direct response to the threat of Soviet nuclear attack. Workers blasted 500,000 cubic yards of solid greenstone rock out of the mountain in under 10 months. By 1953, 3 underground buildings were already complete. The price tag by 1954 had climbed to $35 million, about $350 million in today's money. What's inside? 5 freestanding 3-story buildings that look like ordinary office blocks, except they're inside a mountain. There's a power plant, underground water reservoirs, air filtration systems, a fire department, a medical facility, dining halls, and reportedly a small chapel and a bar. The facility can sustain up to 3,000 government and military personnel, completely sealed off from the outside world for extended periods. Officially, Site R functions as the alternate National Military Command Center, the backup Pentagon, essentially. Its only documented emergency activation came on September 11, 2001, when Vice President Dick Cheney and other high-ranking officials were evacuated there after the Pentagon was attacked. Author Garrett Graff, who spent years researching the facility, described it plainly. These are not backyard fallout shelters. These are hollowed-out mountains with small cities built inside. Locals know it's there. The township supervisor of Liberty Township, where the complex is located, once told reporters his total knowledge of the facility amounted to, "I know there's an antenna on top of the mountain," which is probably exactly how the Department of Defense prefers it. The facility sits about 6 miles north of Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland, a proximity that has fueled decades of speculation about underground tunnels connecting the two. The government has never confirmed or denied that theory. What is confirmed is that Raven Rock receives annual federal appropriations. Nearly $45 million was allocated in 2018 alone for daily upkeep and improvements. Something down there needs a lot of maintaining. Tours are not offered. Access beyond the perimeter fence is not permitted. The facility remains fully operational today, staffed around the clock, blending into the Pennsylvania farmland around it as if it were just another feature of the landscape. Number 19, Centralia, Columbia County. There are ghost towns, and then there's Centralia, a borough that the earth itself decided to swallow. Centralia was a typical Pennsylvania coal mining town with about 1,100 residents as of 1962. In May of that year, members of the volunteer fire company were hired by the borough council to clean up the local landfill before Memorial Day. Their method? They set it on fire. It was something they'd done before. This time, the fire found its way through a hole in the pit and into the vast network of abandoned anthracite coal mines running underneath the town. Over the next 2 decades, 8 separate attempts were made to extinguish the underground blaze. All of them failed. Carbon monoxide began seeping through the soil. Sinkholes appeared in front yards. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski fell into a suddenly opening sinkhole in his grandmother's backyard and barely escaped with his life, held up by a tree root while toxic gas poured up around him. In 1983, Congress allocated over $42 million to relocate residents. Most took the offer. In 1992, Pennsylvania Governor Bob Casey invoked eminent domain, condemned every property in Centralia, and formally erased the borough. The zip code was discontinued in 2002. Thousands of structures were demolished. Only a handful of residents refused to leave and were allowed to remain under a court-negotiated agreement, with the stipulation that their properties revert to the state upon their deaths. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection states clearly that the area is extremely dangerous and strongly discourages visits. Carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and other toxic gases vent unpredictably through cracks in the earth. The ground is prone to sudden collapse with zero warning. Geologist Steve Jones, who studied the fire extensively, gave perhaps the most honest assessment of the situation. Putting it out is the impossible dream. According to DEP estimates, the fire could burn for another century, or longer. The famous Graffiti Highway, a stretch of abandoned Route 61, was buried under dirt in April 2020 to discourage trespassers. Today, Centralia is mostly empty lots, cracked concrete, and wisps of smoke rising from the ground on cold mornings. It's one of those places where the sheer scale of the failure, governmental, industrial, environmental, is written directly into the landscape. What makes Centralia particularly difficult to process is the timeline. The fire started in 1962. By 1983, 21 years had passed, and the federal government's conclusion was, essentially, too hard, too expensive, not happening. Congress paid people to leave instead. The fire has now been burning for over 60 years, with state geologists estimating it could continue for at least another century across a stretch of roughly 3,700 acres. There is currently no plan to extinguish it. None. A handful of residents remain, living out the arrangement they negotiated with the state in 2013, permitted to stay for the rest of their lives, after which the last properties revert to the Commonwealth. The borough technically still exists on paper, but it has no zip code, no services, and a population that can be counted on one hand. Number 18. Eastern State Penitentiary, Philadelphia, restricted areas. Eastern State Penitentiary opened in 1829 and was, at the time of its completion, the most expensive public structure ever built in the United States. Designed by British architect John Haviland, it introduced what became known as the Pennsylvania system, total solitary confinement as a means of rehabilitation. Every prisoner spent their entire sentence in isolation, alone in a cell with a small exercise yard attached. Human contact was virtually forbidden. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and was appalled. He wrote that solitary confinement was a depth of terrible endurance in it, which no man has a right to inflict upon his fellow creature, calling it worse than any physical torture. By 1913, even the penitentiary itself had abandoned the system due to overcrowding. The prison went on to house notable inmates, including Al Capone, who served 8 months there in 1929 and 1930, and bank robber Willie Sutton, who managed to escape in 1945 through a tunnel, along with 11 other inmates, before being recaptured the same day by Philadelphia police. Eastern State closed in 1971. For nearly 20 years afterward, it sat abandoned, overgrown with vegetation, home to feral cats, and gradually crumbling. It reopened as a museum in 1994. Here's the thing, though. While the main corridors are open to the public, a significant portion of the prison's cell blocks remain completely off limits. Many cells are still filled with the original rubble and debris from decades of neglect. Certain wings have not been stabilized and are structurally compromised. Whatever remains sealed inside those blocks, the decades of accumulated human despair, the physical remnants of what happened in those rooms, stays sealed. The penitentiary housed over 85,000 inmates during its 142 years of operation. Some of the punishments documented during its early decades, the iron gag, the mad chair, prolonged total darkness, were severe enough to draw formal investigations. Wardens and guards were rarely held accountable. The historical record of what occurred in the closed sections of the facility is incomplete, and in some cases, deliberately obscured. It's the kind of place where the parts you can see are disturbing enough. The parts you can't see are something else entirely. Number 17, Quehanna Wild Area Nuclear Bunkers, Cameron County. In the 1950s, the Curtiss-Wright Corporation quietly acquired 51,000 acres of remote land in the Quehanna Wild Area of Cameron County. They fenced it off completely and began construction. What they built was a nuclear reactor and a series of underground testing bunkers, all part of the U.S. government's Atoms for Peace program, a Cold War initiative whose goal was to develop nuclear-powered jet engines for Air Force bombers that could stay airborne indefinitely without ever needing to refuel. The bunkers themselves are massive concrete and steel structures with narrow slit windows, once fitted with thick, blast-resistant glass. Engineers and technicians would have sat behind those windows, monitoring jet engines being run on nuclear power. The entire site was classified. By 1960, the program was scrapped. The technology was deemed impractical, and the facility was decommissioned. The nuclear reactor has long since been dismantled, but the bunkers remain buried in the woods of Cameron County. Access is not permitted. However, the structures are visible above ground to those who know where to look, and it is possible to peer into a few exposed openings to glimpse the concrete interior. It's a remarkably strange corner of Pennsylvania history, one that involves nuclear power, jet engines, the Cold War, and 51,000 acres of forest that the government quietly borrowed from the public without much explanation. Number 16, Fric's Lock, Chester County. Fric's Lock is one of Pennsylvania's most visually intact ghost villages, a cluster of 18th and 19th century buildings standing almost exactly as they were left, frozen in time, with nature slowly reclaiming the edges. The village thrived during the Canal era as a hub on the Schuylkill navigation system. At its peak in the mid-1800s, over 1 million tons of coal passed through the waterway annually. The village had a lockkeeper's house, a mill, workshops, and residences. Then the railroad killed the canal industry, floods hit in the 1930s, and the population gradually drained away. What finished it completely was the construction of the Limerick nuclear power plant in the early 1980s. The remaining residents were displaced as the plant expanded, and the village was placed under security restrictions. Today, Fric's Lock sits behind security fencing on land associated with the nuclear facility. The buildings, some dating back to the 1700s, are still standing but largely inaccessible. The East Coventry Historical Commission occasionally organizes guided tours, offering rare glimpses inside. But most of the year, it sits there, locked, intact, and waiting. Number 15, Sideling Hill POW Camp, Fulton County. Here's one that almost nobody talks about. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, the U.S. military established Sideling Hill POW Camp in Fulton County to house German prisoners of war. Today, the abandoned ruins of the camp sit in the Buchanan State Forest. Deteriorating officer quarters, crumbling infrastructure, and the residual silence of a facility that processed the defeated. Access to the interior structures is restricted due to structural instability, but the site can be explored from the perimeter. What's strange about it isn't the danger, it's the near-total public ignorance of its existence. A World War II prisoner of war camp sitting in a Pennsylvania forest, largely forgotten. Number 14, Pine Grove Furnace POW Interrogation Camp, Cumberland County. Related in era but entirely different in purpose, the Pine Grove Furnace Prisoner of War Interrogation Camp in Cumberland County was classified as secret for the duration of its operation. German and Japanese officers captured during World War II were brought here and interrogated. No civilians were allowed to work there or have knowledge of the facility. After the war, the site became a church camp and operated until the early 1970s. Today, the ruins sit in the Michaud State Forest. Stone foundations, scattered remnants of structures, and a flagpole site that's oddly maintained relative to everything around it. The secrecy has never fully lifted. Most people driving through Michaud State Forest have no idea they're passing the remnants of a wartime intelligence operation. Number 13. Concrete City, Luzerne County. Concrete City was built in 1911 by the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Coal Company to house miners and their families in Nanticoke. The name describes exactly what it is. 12 double-family homes, all built entirely from poured concrete. No wood, no brick, just solid, unyielding, gray concrete. The problem was that concrete doesn't breathe. The houses had no indoor plumbing and were cold, damp, and miserable. By 1924, just 13 years after construction, the company abandoned the development and the residents were moved out. The buildings have been sitting there ever since, gradually deteriorating but stubbornly refusing to fully collapse because, well, concrete. The site is on city-owned land in Nanticoke, partially fenced, and access is restricted due to structural hazards. The buildings are unstable, with collapsing ceilings and compromised floors. What remains is a deeply strange collection of skeletal concrete shells buried in overgrowth, looking genuinely like something out of a dystopian film, which, in a sense, it is. Number 12. Wehrum, Indiana County. Wehrum was a company coal mining town in Indiana County that existed from the 1890s until the mid-20th century. At its peak, several hundred people lived there, entirely dependent on the mining company that owned every building, the store, and effectively the town itself. When the coal ran out and the mine closed, the company left. Everyone left. The structures were abandoned to the forest, and within decades, the trees took back what the miners had cleared. Today, Wehrum exists as scattered stone foundations, collapsed walls, and overgrown sidewalks, deep in state forest land, far from any main road. It can technically be accessed via hiking trail, but the remote location and unstable structural remnants make it genuinely hazardous. There are no signs, no markers, just the ruins, the forest, and the particular quiet that settles over places that have been empty for generations. Number 11. Landrus, Tioga County. Landrus in Tioga County follows the same pattern as Wehrum, a coal and lumber company town that thrived, collapsed, and vanished. The settlement grew up around the timber and mining industries in the late 19th century, housed workers and their families, and was entirely dismantled once the resources were exhausted. The ruins lie deep in Tioga County Forest, the paths to them difficult to follow, and the terrain genuinely challenging. What remains is mostly foundations and the occasional standing wall, surrounded by dense second-growth forest that has been undisturbed for decades. It's the kind of place that requires real effort to reach, and once you're there, the silence is almost physical. Number 10. Alvira Bunkers, Union County. During World War II, the U.S. government used eminent domain to seize farmland in Union County and evict 158 families from their homes. In their place, the government built a TNT and munitions manufacturing facility called the Susquehanna Ordnance Depot. At its peak, the plant employed thousands of workers producing explosive shells for the war effort. After the war, the manufacturing infrastructure was largely removed, but the storage bunkers, over 100 of them, were left in place, half buried in the earth across what is now state game lands near Williamsport. The area became known as the Alvira Bunkers. The bunkers are scattered across the game lands, their grass-covered concrete roofs visible above the ground like a series of strange green mounds. Access to the interiors is restricted. The history they represent, the forced displacement of over 150 families, the wartime urgency, the industrial scale, is largely unmarked. There are no historical signs explaining what this field of mounds actually is. Hunters and hikers who visit the area for entirely different reasons occasionally stumble across the structures with no idea what they're looking at. The families who were removed in the 1940s were never able to return. Their farms, their cemeteries, and their community were absorbed into a government weapons facility and then converted to game lands without ceremony. The only evidence that people once lived there, apart from the bunkers themselves, is the occasional stone foundation visible under the vegetation. Number 9. Dead Man's Hollow, Allegheny County. The name alone should give you some idea of the reputation. Dead Man's Hollow is a forested preserve along the Youghiogheny River in Allegheny County, covering over 400 acres of dense woodland, steep ravines, and winding trails that have a documented history of hikers becoming seriously disoriented. The hollow gets its name from a history of deaths in the area, both industrial accidents from its coal mining past and more recent incidents involving hikers and recreational visitors. The terrain is steep, the trails unmarked in sections, and the dense canopy means navigation is genuinely difficult in all but the most open areas. Certain sections of the hollow are formally restricted due to hazardous land conditions, old mine workings beneath the surface, and unstable slopes. The preserve is managed by the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, and specific interior zones are off limits to the public. Number 8. Lights Fort, Westmoreland County. Lights Fort was built in the 1700s in Westmoreland County during the period of frontier conflict between European settlers and Native American tribes. The stone structure served as a defensive fortification, and it survives today, or partially survives, with aging walls, a deteriorated interior, and a network of tunnels beneath the structure that were once part of its defensive design. The tunnels are now structurally unstable and completely off-limits. The main structure itself is in a state of continued deterioration, with access formally restricted due to the risk of collapse. It sits on private property with no public access. What's unusual about Lights Fort is how completely it has vanished from public awareness. A 300-year-old fortification in a mid-Atlantic state should be a reasonably well-known historical site. Instead, it sits quietly collapsing, unknown to most Pennsylvanians. Number 7. The abandoned Pennsylvania Turnpike, Bedford and Fulton counties. Between Bedford and Fulton counties, there are 8.5 miles of abandoned 4-lane highway that have been sitting untouched since 1968, when a new alignment of the Pennsylvania Turnpike bypassed it. The old route includes 2 tunnels, each approximately 1 mile long, the Sideling Hill Tunnel and the Rays Hill Tunnel, both carved through the Appalachian ridges in the 1930s. The tunnels are completely dark, heavily vandalized, and structurally compromised in sections. The road surface has been buckled by decades of freeze-thaw cycles and vegetation growth. The Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission, which owns the property, has been formally assessing the route for years. Officially, the tunnels are closed and entry is prohibited. The above-ground road surface is technically passable as a hiking trail, designated as the Old PA Pike Trail, but the tunnels themselves remain restricted. In recent years, access has become increasingly limited due to liability concerns and structural deterioration. It is a genuinely strange piece of American infrastructure. A superhighway to nowhere, running through mountains, abandoned for more than half a century. Number 6. Gettysburg National Military Park, Restricted Zones. Gettysburg is one of the most visited historic sites in the United States, and most of it is accessible. The battlefield itself, however, contains numerous restricted zones, unstable earthworks, unexcavated burial areas, and protected archaeological sites where the ground has not been disturbed since July 1863. The National Park Service enforces strict access limitations across large portions of the battlefield, particularly in areas where unexploded ordnance has been discovered. Between 1863 and the present day, live artillery shells, bullets, and other munitions have continued to surface across the fields, occasionally found by groundskeepers or maintenance crews. Entire sections remain off-limits pending ongoing archaeological surveys. The scale of what happened at Gettysburg over 3 days in July 1863, roughly 51,000 casualties, means the ground itself is, in a very literal sense, still holding its history. The Park Service estimates that thousands of soldiers remain unaccounted for, their remains never recovered. Some sections of the battlefield may well stay restricted indefinitely. Number 5. The abandoned Bayless Paper Mill, Potter County. The Bayless Paper Mill in Austin, Potter County, is permanently linked to one of the worst disasters in Pennsylvania history. On September 30th, 1911, the Austin Dam, which supplied water to the paper mill, catastrophically failed, sending a wall of water through the valley below. At least 78 people died, making it Pennsylvania's second deadliest flood on record. The paper mill itself was destroyed. Rebuilding was attempted, but a second dam failure in 1942 ended any remaining industrial activity. The ruins of the mill and the dam site sit on private property in the floodplain. Access is restricted, and the area downstream from the original dam location still carries the physical scars of the 1911 collapse, altered topography, exposed foundations, and the particular desolation of a place that was remade by catastrophic water pressure in a matter of minutes. Number 4. Eckley Miners Village, Luzerne County, unexplored sections. Eckley Miners Village in Luzerne County is a preserved 19th century anthracite coal mining community that functions as a state museum, and much of it is open to the public. But like Eastern State Penitentiary, open to the public covers only a carefully controlled portion of what actually exists on the grounds. The village contains original company-owned structures dating to the 1850s, and several buildings have never been fully stabilized or opened. The history of Eckley includes the Molly Maguires, the secret society of Irish immigrant miners who used organized violence to resist exploitation by coal companies in the 1860s and 1870s. Several suspected Molly Maguires came from communities near Eckley, and the violence of that era is woven directly into the village's history. The sections of Eckley that remain closed are generally those with unstable structures or ongoing preservation work. Given the depth of history the site contains, what hasn't been open to the public is almost certainly as significant as what has. Number 3. Chestnut Hill College Tunnels, Philadelphia. Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia is a private Catholic liberal arts institution founded in 1924 by the Sisters of St. Joseph. Beneath the campus runs a network of utility and service tunnels that connect the college's historic buildings, some of which date to the 19th century before the college was formally established. The tunnels are not open to the public, and even access for students and most staff is restricted. Their exact configuration is not publicly documented. The age and origin of portions of the tunnel network are unclear. There are persistent accounts from those who have encountered them describing a system considerably older and more extensive than what any campus utility requirement would explain. Whether that's accurate or not, the fact remains: they're sealed. They're under a 100-year-old college on a hill in Philadelphia, and nobody outside the institution's facilities management has a clear picture of what's actually down there. Number 2. Laurel Caverns, Fayette County, deep sections. Laurel Caverns in Fayette County is the largest cave in Pennsylvania and is open for guided tours through its main chambers. The cave system extends approximately 3 miles of mapped passages, the passages that have been mapped. Beyond the tourist-accessible sections, Laurel Caverns contains unmapped and restricted areas where the cave passages narrow, the terrain becomes unstable, and the depth of the cave system makes safe navigation without specialized equipment genuinely hazardous. Experienced cave explorers, cavers, occasionally get permits for deeper exploration, but the vast majority of the system's interior has never been fully documented. The caves were used by Native Americans for thousands of years, and later by European settlers. What may remain in the deeper, unmapped sections, archaeological material, geological formations, or simply cave passage that no human being has ever entered, is genuinely unknown. Number 1. Fort Mifflin, Philadelphia, underground sections. Fort Mifflin sits on Mud Island in the Delaware River, just south of Philadelphia, and it is the only fort in America that was occupied by soldiers during the Revolutionary War. It was bombarded continuously by the British for 6 weeks in 1777 in one of the longest sieges of the war. American defenders held the fort to delay British supply lines from reaching occupied Philadelphia. The fort is open for tours, and it is one of the most historically significant sites in Pennsylvania. But beneath the fort's grounds lies a network of underground passages and storage areas that are not accessible to the general public. These areas include original 18th century construction, portions of which have never been fully excavated or documented. The Delaware River has been gradually encroaching on the island over the centuries, and the underground sections of the fort are subject to water infiltration and structural instability. Archaeologists and historians believe there may be undisturbed material in the sealed portions, artifacts, records, or structural elements from the original 1770s fortifications that haven't been touched since the Revolutionary War period. Fort Mifflin holds events and tours regularly, but the underground remains closed. Whatever the 18th century left behind in those passages, it hasn't been moved. Given how thoroughly the rest of the Philadelphia region has been excavated, developed, and documented over the past 250 years, the sealed sections of Fort Mifflin represent one of the more unusual surviving pockets of genuinely undisturbed early American history. Sitting on an island in a river, in the shadow of an international airport, waiting, Pennsylvania has more history packed into its borders than most states will ever see. And most of that history is on the surface, accessible, and documented. But these 20 places are the ones that stayed hidden, stayed sealed, stayed burning, or simply stayed put behind a fence with no explanation offered. Some are dangerous, some are classified, some are just old enough that nobody's entirely sure what's in there anymore. If you found this video interesting, hit that like button and subscribe. We cover the stories that don't make it onto the tourist maps.